I came home with my shoulders up around my ears the way they get when I have spent all day swallowing other people's moods, and all I wanted was the soft click of my deadbolt and the quiet that belonged to me. My hand was still on the knob when I noticed the smell, not my lavender cleaner, not the faint coffee I always forgot to throw out, but something sweet and cheap, like vanilla body spray and microwave popcorn. Then I heard it a laugh. Not from my TV, not from the hallway, but from inside my apartment. My stomach tightened so fast it felt like a fist. I pushed the door open and stopped, because my living room looked like it had been lived in while I was gone, and my sister's suitcase was sitting by my couch, like it had always had a right to be there. For a second, I just stood in the doorway, my work bag sliding down my arm, my fingers still curled around my keys like they were the only thing I could trust. The overhead light was on, which I never left on. My throw blanket was folded wrong. Someone had put a pair of shoes I did not recognize on my shoe tray, toes pointed out like they owned the space. My pulse was loud in my ears, and I had that strange floating feeling like my body was still in the hallway, but my mind had already sprinted ahead, searching for an explanation that would not make me feel ridiculous. Then my sister Tessa popped up from my couch, hair in a messy bun, one of my mugs in her hand, like it was the most natural thing in the world for her to be there. "Oh, hey," she said, casual, almost cheerful, like I had walked into her place by mistake. I blinked at her once, twice, trying to make my eyes match what I was seeing. Tessa was 29, and she had always had this talent for turning any room she entered into a room that existed for her. She did it with a smile, with a sigh, with a little shrug that said, "You are being dramatic," without ever saying the words. My mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. I took one step in, then another, and I realized the sound I had heard wasn't just her. There was a kid, a little boy, probably 5 or 6, sitting on my rug with a tablet volume up, and he glanced at me like I was the stranger. Behind him, a plastic grocery bag was hanging from my lamp, stuffed with snacks. My lamp, the one I had saved up for because it made my living room feel grown up. "Tessa, I finally managed. What is this?" She took a sip from my mug. "It's fine," she said. "Don't freak out. Don't freak out." That phrase hit me like a flashback to every holiday I had ever spent watching her create a mess and then complain that I was stressing her out by noticing it. "Where is Mom?" I asked, and I hated that my voice came out thin. As if on cue, my mother's voice floated from my kitchen, humming a tune I recognized from when I was a kid, when she would clean, to pretend everything in our house was normal. "I'm right here, sweetheart," she called, bright and warm, like she was greeting me at her own front door. I walked toward the kitchen on legs that felt stiff, and every step showed me something else that didn't belong. A second coat draped over my dining chair. A stack of mail on my counter, my mail opened. My pantry door standing slightly ajar, the cereal boxes shifted around like someone had been digging for what they wanted. My mother was at my stove stirring something in one of my pots. Her purse sitting on my counter like it had been dropped there without a thought. She turned when she saw me and gave me that smile that always looked generous on the surface and sharp underneath. "There you are," she said. "I was worried you would be late. We ordered groceries, I had them delivered. I figured I would get dinner going so you would not have to." My brain snagged on one word. "We." I looked at her, then back at the living room, then at the little boy on my rug, and something cold settled in my chest. This wasn't a visit. This wasn't a stop-by. This wasn't my mom dropping off leftovers like she sometimes did, still clinging to the idea that she was the kind of mother who showed up with food and comfort. This was a move in. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice low the way you do when you are trying not to scare yourself. "Why is Tessa's suitcase in my living room?" My mother made a little tisk sound like I was focusing on the wrong thing. "Honey," she said, "don't start. It has been a day. We are all exhausted. We..." I put my work bag down slowly, like a sudden movement might crack something open inside me. I felt the urge to raise my voice to demand answers, to tell her she could not just waltz into my apartment and start cooking like she was doing me a favor. But I also felt that familiar pressure in my throat, the one that showed up whenever I challenged her, the pressure that said, if you push, she will make you pay for it, and she will make you look like the unreasonable one. I didn't ask you to make dinner, I said. I asked why they are here. Tessa leaned against my doorway, still holding my mug, and she rolled her eyes. Because I needed somewhere to go, she said. It's not that deep. My mother set the spoon down with a deliberate calm. Tessa had a situation, she said. You know how things are. She needed a safe place, and you have the space. You are family. I stared at her, and for a second the whole room tilted. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment. It felt spacious to me because I had fought for it, worked for it, built it out of long shifts and skipped weekends. But it wasn't space for other people to claim. It was my space, my peace, my proof that I could be an adult without my family's noise filling every corner. Who is that child? I asked, nodding toward my living room. Tessa's shoulders tensed. It's Mason, she said. It's temporary. Temporary. That word made my skin crawl. In my family, temporary meant indefinite. Temporary meant until you stop complaining or you break down and accept it. Temporary meant they would turn my one bedroom into a crowded little orbit around their needs and call me selfish for wanting to breathe. Why is Mason here? I asked again, slower, watching their faces. My mother sighed as if I was being difficult on purpose. Because Tessa cannot do this alone right now, she said. And I cannot do it either, not with everything else going on. You are good with kids. You have always been good with kids. This will be good for you. Good for me. Like my home had been empty in a sad way, not in a restful way. Like my quiet was a problem she needed to fix. I felt heat rise up my neck. My hands curled into fists before I could stop them. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and steady like a warning drum. You did not ask, I said. You did not call me. You did not even text me. You just brought them here. My mother's smile tightened. I tried to call, she said. You were working. And it was urgent. It is not like we had time to wait for you to come home and have a long talk. A long talk. That would have been code for her wearing me down until I said yes, just to end it. She knew that. I knew that. I looked at my front door, then at my keys in my hand. My key ring had a chipped little wooden tag on it, a cheap thing I bought at a street fair, because it made me feel like the kind of person with a stable life. I had never handed my keys to anyone. Not to Tessa, not to my mom, not even to my closest friend, because my apartment had been the one place where my mother's opinions and my sister's chaos could not reach me. How did you get in? I asked, and my voice came out sharper. Tessa shrugged. Mom let us in. I turned to my mother. Mom. She blinked slowly like she was considering which version of the truth would be easiest to sell. She opened her mouth, then smiled again. Sweetheart, she said, don't get stuck on details. We are here now. Let's be adults about it. Details. The detail was my front door. The detail was my lock. The detail was my home being open to them without my permission. I stepped closer to the counter, lowering my voice without meaning to. Did you have a key? I asked. My mother's eyes flicked away for half a second, just a twitch, but I saw it. That little slip that told me she was calculating. She gave a small laugh. I had one made, she said, as if she was talking about a spare copy for emergencies. It is not a crime. I did it to help you. What if you got locked out? What if something happened to you? I am your mother. My mouth went dry. A key had been copied. My keys copied. Without me knowing. Without me agreeing. My chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. You copied my apartment keys, I said, and I could feel my voice shaking now, not with fear, but with a kind of disbelief that was turning into rage. My mother's face changed just a little, her eyebrows lifting in that practiced way that made her look wounded. "I did not think you would react like this," she said. "I did it out of love, out of responsibility." There it was. The switch. She had broken a boundary and she was already rewriting it as something noble, something I should thank her for. Tessa laughed under her breath. "Oh my God," she said, "it's not like we broke in." I stared at her. That was exactly what it was. But in this family, words were slippery. If we named things accurately, my mother would have to see herself clearly, and she did not do that. She would rather paint me as dramatic than admit she had crossed a line. My mother turned back to the stove, picking up the spoon again as if stirring dinner could stir the problem away. "It is just for a little while," she said. "We will figure out the rest. But tonight, you can relax. Sit. Eat. You look tired." I was tired. I was tired in my bones. But not the kind of tired she was talking about, not the kind that could be fixed with food. I was tired of my family treating my competence like a contract I never signed. Tired of them treating my apartment like overflow space. Tired of being the one who adjusted while everyone else stayed the same. The little boy on my rug laughed at something on his tablet volume too loud, and I felt something crack inside me. Not fully, not yet, but enough that I knew I could not go back to pretending this was normal. I took a slow breath through my nose. I tried to picture myself yelling, demanding they leave, calling the police right then. The fantasy flared hot and bright, and then it dimmed when I saw what would happen next. My mother would cry. Tessa would call me heartless. Someone would record it. Family would hear a version of the story where I kicked out a child. They would talk about it at church, at the grocery store, at every holiday until the end of time. My mother's weapon was never a fist. It was reputation. It was shame. It was the threat of being labeled ungrateful. I set my keys down on the counter carefully, like putting down a blade. "I need a minute," I said, and I walked into my bedroom, closing the door behind me. The second the door clicked shut, my hands started shaking. I pressed my palms to my thighs, trying to ground myself. My bedroom looked mostly the same, but even there I saw it. My closet door wasn't fully closed. One of my drawers was slightly open, the edge of a shirt peeking out. Someone had been in here, or at least had walked too close to the places that were mine. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall, listening. My mother's voice drifted through the thin door light and cheerful, like she was hosting. Tessa's laugh, that careless laugh. The child's tablet. The clink of a spoon against my pot. And then, in between sounds, I heard my own thoughts, sharp and clear. "She copied your keys." My phone buzzed on my nightstand. A notification, a group text, the family chat that I muted but never fully left because leaving it would become its own fight. I glanced at the screen. A message from my mother sent while I was standing in my own kitchen, like she needed to cement her version of reality. "We are all together tonight," she had written with a little heart at the end, and then, "Thank you for being the stable one you always come through." Stable one. That phrase was another leash dressed up as a compliment. I set the phone down and stared at my reflection in the dark screen. I looked like myself, 28, hair pulled back, faint lines of stress around my mouth, the kind of face that had learned to smile politely even when it wanted to scream. I thought about the last year, the way I had built my life inch by inch. This apartment, my job, my quiet routines, the safety of knowing that when I locked my door, I could exhale. And now, my mother had a key. That realization turned my nausea into something colder, something steadier. Because it was not just that she had moved Tessa in, it was that she had done it in a way that proved she believed she had the right. I got up and walked to my window, looking down at the parking lot. A few cars, a neighbor carrying groceries. Normal life continuing, unaware that my world had just shifted. I pictured my mother's face when I confronted her again. She would deny. She would soften. She would spin. She would make me the problem. So I did the one thing she never expected from me. I didn't go back out there and fight. Not yet. Instead, I took another slow breath, and I made a decision so quiet it almost felt like a secret. I was going to pretend I didn't know what that copied key really meant. I was going to let them believe I would fold like I always had. I was going to watch and listen and collect every little moment they thought was harmless. Because if my mother wanted to turn my apartment into a stage for her family drama, then fine, I would let her set the scene. But I would be the one writing the ending. I opened my bedroom door and stepped back into the hallway. My face calm, my voice steady, like I had swallowed the storm. "Dinner smells good," I said, and my mother's shoulders relaxed instantly like she had won. I walked into my kitchen, sat down at my own table, and nodded like everything was fine. Inside, though, something had already shifted, and I knew I couldn't afford to waste another night acting like a boundary only mattered if my mother agreed it existed. I woke up before my alarm, not because I was rested, but because my body no longer trusted the quiet. For a split second, I forgot why my chest felt tight. Then a cupboard slammed somewhere outside my bedroom, and the memory rushed back in. My apartment was awake without me. Someone else was already deciding how the morning would go. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening. Footsteps that were not mine. The low murmur of my mother's voice, cheerful and directive. The scrape of a chair being dragged across my kitchen floor. A child whining about cereal. It felt like waking up in the wrong house, the kind of disorienting moment where you reach for comfort and find none. When I finally pushed myself out of bed, I moved slowly, like if I went fast, I might shatter whatever thin layer of control I had left. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The smell of toast hit me first, then coffee stronger than I ever made it. Tessa was already at my table, hair still messy, scrolling on her phone, one leg tucked up on the chair like she had been there for years. Mason sat beside her, crumbs on my placemat, tapping his spoon against my bowl. "Morning," my mom said from the stove too brightly. "You look tired. Did you sleep at all?" I nodded because nodding was easier than saying what I wanted to say, which was that I hadn't slept because my home no longer felt like a place I could rest. She slid a mug across the counter toward me. Not my mug, one she had pulled from the back of my cabinet like she was rearranging my life piece by piece. "Drink this," she said. "You always forget to eat when you're stressed." I wrapped my hands around the mug without drinking. The coffee was too hot, like everything else in that kitchen. Tessa didn't look up. She was already talking about her plans for the day, about errands she needed to run, about how I would need to keep an eye on Mason for a bit because she had calls to make. For a moment, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar it bordered on absurd. I had been awake for less than 10 minutes, and already my time had been allocated. That was when it hit me, not as anger, but as recognition. This feeling. This role. I had been here before, long before I had keys of my own. Growing up, I was the one who stayed close to the house, the one who didn't wander far, who learned early that being helpful meant being noticed, and being noticed meant less chaos. When my mother needed an extra set of hands, they reached for me. When someone had to pick up a cousin from school, it was me. When dinner ran late, I stirred the pot. I was praised for it too. "Such a good girl. So mature for your age. You're so reliable." Reliable. That word followed me like a shadow. It sounded like a compliment, but it behaved like a contract. I remembered being 12 and standing in our kitchen watching my friends ride their bikes past the window while I wiped down counters because my mom had said she needed me. I remembered being 15 and canceling plans because Tessa was having a hard week and needed support. I remembered being 22 and sending my mother money I couldn't afford because she said it was just until Friday. Every time I told myself it was temporary. Every time it became expected. The thing about being the reliable one is that people stop asking if you are available. They just assume you will rearrange yourself. And if you don't, they act shocked like you've broken an unspoken rule. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee cooling in my hands, and watched it happen again. My mother talked about the day like it was already decided. Tessa talked about her stress like it automatically outranked mine. Mason tugged at my sleeve, asking for help with his tablet, and I helped him without thinking because my body knew the move even when my mind resisted it. "You're so good with him," my mom said, smiling like she was proud of me for stepping back into place. Something twisted in my chest. Not guilt, not obligation. Something closer to resentment, sharp and uncomfortable. I carried my mug to the sink and set it down untouched. I watched my mother flip pancakes with my spatula, watched Tessa leave her plate on the table when she stood up, watched Mason wander off with sticky fingers toward my couch. It was like seeing a pattern I had lived inside of for years from the outside for the first time. At one point, my mom glanced at me and said, "We'll need to figure out sleeping arrangements soon," as if that was a normal thing to say in someone else's home. I caught myself about to ask what she meant, then stopped. I already knew. This wasn't a visit. This wasn't a favor. This was my old role unpacked and set back into my living room like it had never left. The realization sat heavy in my stomach as the morning went on. I tried to work from my laptop at the corner of the table, but every few minutes someone needed something. A snack, a charger, a quiet place to take a call. Each interruption was small, polite even, but together they erased me. At one point, I stood up to grab a notebook from my room and my mother said, "Where are you going?" without thinking, like she was tracking inventory. The question stopped me cold. "My room," I said, forcing a casual tone. She nodded, distracted, already moving on. But the damage was done. I felt it then, clear as day. My presence was being monitored, my space was being managed, and I was expected to accept it because I always had. I closed my bedroom door behind me and leaned against it, pressing my forehead to the wood. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror, eyes tired but alert. I looked like someone who had just woken up to the truth a little too late. I thought about the times I had asked for help and been told no. The time I needed a cosigner and my mother had hesitated, reminding me that responsibility mattered. The time I had asked Tessa to watch my place for a weekend, and she had said she couldn't handle that kind of pressure. Funny how responsibility only mattered when it protected them. I sat on the edge of my bed and let myself feel the anger I had always swallowed. It was not explosive. It was steady, heavy. The kind that comes when you realize you have been playing by rules no one else agreed to follow. By the time I went back into the living room, I had made a quiet decision. I was not going to argue today. I was not going to demand explanations or ultimatums. I had tried that version of myself before, and it always ended the same way, with me apologizing for wanting less. Instead, I watched. I watched my mother answer a call and talk about the apartment like it was a shared resource. I watched Tessa complain about how hard everything was, without once acknowledging the inconvenience she was creating. I watched how easily my no from the night before had been erased by the assumption that mourning meant compliance. And something else happened too. I started noticing details I would have missed before. The way my mother spoke in certainties, not possibilities. The way Tessa referred to next week, not tonight. The way Mason's backpack was tucked neatly into my hall closet, not left by the door like a temporary thing. This was not chaos. This was planning. The realization sent a chill through me. I had been framing this as emotional overreach, as entitlement, but there was something more deliberate under it. They had not just assumed I would help. They had organized their lives around it. I felt a flicker of fear, then followed by something surprising. Relief. Because fear, I understood. Fear meant there was something to protect. I sat back down at the table and opened my laptop again, not to work, but to create the appearance of it. My mother glanced at me and smiled, satisfied, like she had checked a box. "Good," she said. "I knew you'd come around." I didn't correct her. I didn't smile back. I just nodded and typed nonsense into a document, letting her believe whatever she needed to believe. Inside, though, something had shifted. I was no longer trying to make them see me. I was trying to see them clearly, and for the first time I allowed myself to wonder what would happen if I stopped being the reliable one, if I stopped absorbing the impact so no one else had to, if I let the consequences land where they belonged. The thought was unsettling. It was also strangely calming. That afternoon, when my mother asked me to adjust my schedule for the rest of the week, I said we'll see, and meant something very different than she heard. When Tessa asked if I could handle things tomorrow, I said I'd let her know, and watched her assume that meant yes. I went to bed that night with my door locked, a habit I had never needed before. The apartment was loud, full of other people's lives, but my mind was quiet in a way it hadn't been in years, because now I understood something I had never fully named before. This was not about one night or one favor or even one copied key. This was about a lifetime of access granted without consent and taken for granted without question. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that if I didn't change the pattern now, it would never change on its own. So I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of my family moving through my space, and I made myself a promise. I would not explode. I would not beg. I would not explain myself into exhaustion. I would pay attention. And whatever came next, I would make sure it was on my terms. The next day, I learned there are two kinds of tired: the tired that comes from working too much, and the tired that comes from being crowded out of your own life. I felt the second kind in my teeth, in my shoulders, in the way my jaw stayed clenched even when I was trying to smile. I went to work, I did my job, I answered emails, I nodded in meetings, and all day long I could feel my apartment like a weight strapped to my back, a place that was supposed to be mine now full of other people's noise. When I got home that evening, the hallway smelled like fried food and some kind of fruity candle. I paused outside my door, listening the way you listen when you are about to walk into something you cannot control. I heard Mason laughing the TV too loud again, and my mother's voice cutting through it, sweet and sharp at the same time. I unlocked the deadbolt and stepped inside, and the first thing I saw was a set of plastic storage bins stacked along my wall, three of them labeled in thick black marker: Tessa, Mason, Misk. My wall. My living room. My breath caught because bins did not mean visiting. Bins meant settling. Tessa popped her head out of my kitchen like she had been waiting for me. "Hey," she said, "can you help me for a second? Help you with what I asked already, knowing I would regret walking farther in." She pointed at the bins like it was obvious. "I need somewhere to put my stuff. Mom said we could organize the closet so it's easier. You have all that space in there." My closet was not all that space. It was one small closet that held my life, my work clothes, my winter coat, the few nice things I had bought myself over the years, as proof that I was building something. The idea of my sister organizing it, meaning pushing my things aside, made my stomach turn. I set my bag down slowly, like if I moved too fast I would say something I couldn't take back. I looked past her into the kitchen. My mother was at my counter again, chopping vegetables, calm as a person with no fear of consequences. She didn't even glance up, just spoke like she was continuing a conversation we had never had. "I thought we could make a little schedule," she said, "so things run smoothly. It'll help everyone. A schedule. In my home. For my time." "What kind of schedule?" I asked, and I kept my voice even because I could feel my temper right under my skin. My mother finally looked up, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Just something simple," she said. "Who handles breakfast, who handles bedtime errands, that kind of thing. You're the most consistent, so you can take weekday evenings. Tessa needs mornings to job hunt and decompress." Decompress. I stared at her, and for a second I couldn't find words. I was working full-time. I was carrying my own bills. I was paying for this apartment. And she was assigning me weekday evenings like I was a volunteer at a community center. I swallowed hard. "That doesn't work for me," I said, and it was the first time I had said something close to a no since they arrived. My mother's smile flickered, then returned brighter. "We'll adjust," she said, as if I had offered a preference instead of refusing. "We can talk later. Right now, dinner needs to happen." She turned back to her chopping, dismissing the entire conversation with the casual confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. I walked into my bedroom and shut the door, not to hide, but because I needed to breathe without an audience. I leaned against the door and stared at my bed, my safe little island, and I tried to name what I was feeling. It wasn't just anger. It was a sense of being erased, of my choices being treated like background noise. I opened my phone and scrolled without seeing, just needing something to do with my hands. A text from my mother popped up, sent while she was 20 feet away in my kitchen. "Just so you know," she wrote, "I told your aunt we're all together now. She's relieved. Family is best when we pull together." My fingers went numb. She told my aunt. Of course she did. The story was already being spread, already being packaged as a heartwarming family moment, a little family drama turned into togetherness. And if I protested, I wouldn't just be saying no to my mother. I would be ruining the story she'd already told everyone else. I thought about something my therapist once said back when I was trying to untangle why I felt guilty for resting. "You don't just live your life," she said. "You live in the shadow of the consequences other people threaten you with." I hadn't understood it then. I understood it now. When I came back out, I kept my face calm. I helped set the table. I handed Mason a napkin. I listened to Tessa complain about her ex and how unfair her life was, and I nodded like I was supposed to be sympathetic. My mother watched me with quiet satisfaction, like she had won some contest. After dinner, when Mason was half asleep on the couch, my mother said we should go over the budget. "The budget?" I repeated. She opened my kitchen drawer and pulled out a notebook I hadn't seen in months, one I used to track bills when I was first getting on my feet. She placed it on the table like she was laying out evidence. "We're going to need to contribute," she said, "but we need to be smart. Tessa can't afford much right now, and I have expenses, you know that. But you have been managing. You can handle utilities, and we can cover groceries." I stared at her, then at the notebook, then at Tessa, who was already scrolling on her phone, not even pretending to care. "This is my apartment," I said quietly. "My lease, my bills. You don't get to decide my budget." My mother tilted her head the way she did when she was about to turn something into a lesson. "Sweetheart," she said, "don't be dramatic. We're not deciding, we're discussing." "I'm trying to help. Help. Always help. Help that looked a lot like taking." Tessa finally looked up. "It's not forever," she said, like that made it better. "I just need a few months to get back on my feet." A few months. My throat tightened. In my mind, I could see my one-bedroom apartment shrinking, my closet filling with someone else's bins, my evenings swallowed by someone else's schedule. A few months turned into a year, then two. That's how these things went when nobody forced an end. I didn't say any of that out loud. I watched my mother's face. I watched the way her eyes narrowed the slightest bit when I didn't immediately agree. I watched her adjust her posture like a person preparing to push harder. And then, right there at my table, she slipped. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some villain confession. It was just a casual comment thrown out like it was harmless. "I told your brother we'd be here through the spring," she said, as if she was talking about a holiday plan. "He said it makes sense. This neighborhood is good, and you're close to your job. It's practical. Through the spring." The words landed like a punch to my chest. I felt my blood drain, then rush hot. Through the spring meant months. Through the spring meant she had already told someone else a timeline without ever asking me. It meant she had already framed this as settled. Tessa blinked. "Did you?" she started, then stopped, glancing at my mother. My mother waved a hand. "I said might be," she corrected too quickly. "Depending on how things go. We'll see." But the damage was done. My mother didn't say might be when she talked to other people. She said will. She said settled. She said together. I forced my face to stay neutral, but inside, everything rearranged itself. This wasn't an emergency. This wasn't my sister crashing for a few nights. This was a plan. A plan that required my space, my money, my time, and my silence. I stood up and started washing dishes because I needed movement to keep my voice steady. Water ran over my hands, hot enough to sting. I watched my mother from the corner of my eye. She was watching me back, measuring. "You okay?" she asked, a little too sweet. "I'm fine," I said. And it was true in a strange way. I wasn't fine emotionally, but I was clear. Clarity felt like a kind of strength. Later that night, when Tessa finally went into the bedroom that was supposed to be my office, and my mother settled on my couch like she was staying the night, I sat on my bed with my laptop open. I didn't start searching for apartments for them. I didn't start texting friends for advice. I did something else. I started going back through the last couple of weeks in my mind, looking for the pieces I had ignored. The phone call from my mother 2 weeks ago, when she asked where I kept my spare batteries, and laughed when I said I didn't keep them in a specific place. The random question about whether my building had security cameras. The way she had offered to help me carry groceries one day, and had lingered by my keys asking if I still kept them in the bowl by the door. At the time, those moments had felt like background noise. Now they lined up like a trail. My stomach turned. She hadn't just copied my key on a whim. She had been collecting information, testing, planning. I heard a laugh from the living room, my mother talking to someone on the phone. Her voice low, like she didn't want me to hear, but my walls were thin. I caught pieces of it. "She's fine. She always acts tough at first. She'll calm down. She loves being needed. This is good for her." I sat very still, fingers on the keyboard, not typing. The phrase "loves being needed" hit me harder than it should have, because it was how she justified everything. She didn't say, "I want to use her." She said she loves being needed. She didn't say, "I'm taking her space." She said, "It's good for her." That was the trick. Turning my sacrifice into my personality, so if I stopped sacrificing, I stopped being myself. I closed my laptop and stared at the dark screen. My reflection looked back at me, eyes wide, jaw tight. I felt something in me shift again, not just anger now, but alarm. Because if my mother had been planning this, if she had been telling people timelines, if she had been treating my apartment like a shared resource, then there was no gentle way out. They weren't going to leave because it was inconvenient for me. They were going to leave only if something forced them to. I thought about confronting her, really confronting her, saying, "I heard you. I know you told people we'd be here through the spring. I know you copied my keys. I know this was planned." I imagined her face, the wounded look, the outrage, the way she would twist it into me, accusing her unfairly, the way she would pull out the word family like a shield. And I knew something else too. If I confronted her now, she would get careful. She would stop slipping. She would tighten her story. She would make sure there were no more cracks for me to see through. I lay back on my pillow and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of my apartment being lived in without my permission. A cabinet closing, a phone buzzing, a child's sleepy cough. My mother's footsteps as she moved toward the bathroom. I wasn't scared of them physically. It wasn't that kind of situation, but I felt unsafe in a different way, like my stability was being quietly dismantled. And that felt high stakes because stability was everything I had built. I rolled onto my side and looked at my nightstand, at my keys sitting there like a familiar friend that suddenly felt compromised. A copied key meant my mother could get in any time. It meant my apartment was no longer a boundary. It was an extension of her reach. I thought about what that meant if I ever tried to make them leave. Would she let herself in anyway? Would she bring people back? Would she claim she had a right? The thought made my skin crawl. So I made another decision just as quiet as the first one. I wasn't going to blow this up in a burst of emotion. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of calling me unhinged. I was going to keep doing what I had started doing: watching, listening, holding my face steady. Because now I understood the truth. This was not temporary. It was only going to end when I ended it. And tomorrow I was going to start figuring out exactly how. In the morning, I decided to become exactly what they expected me to be: calm, agreeable, useful. I moved through my apartment like a ghost, with a smile, making coffee for everyone, wiping counters that weren't dirty, nodding at plans I had no intention of keeping. If my mother was watching for resistance, she didn't find it. If Tessa was waiting for me to push back, she got bored and stopped looking. It felt strange at first, playing a role I had spent years trying to escape, but there was power in it now. Back then, I had been reliable because I didn't know there was another option. Now I was reliable because I chose to be. That difference mattered more than I expected. My mother noticed the shift immediately. She always did. She watched my face when I handed Mason his breakfast, listened to my tone when I told Tessa I'd handle an errand, measured my body language like a weather forecast. When she didn't sense a storm coming, her shoulders relaxed. She moved through my apartment with more confidence, opening drawers, rearranging shelves, talking on the phone in the living room like she owned the place. I let her. That was the hardest part, letting her think she'd won. Letting her believe I had folded back into the shape she preferred. Every instinct in me wanted to correct her, to remind her that this was still my home, my life, my decision. But I kept my mouth shut and my eyes open. Because the more comfortable she felt, the more she talked. She talked while she cooked, narrating her choices out loud, filling the space with her voice the way she always had. She talked on the phone to friends and relatives, telling the story she wanted them to hear. She talked to Tessa about next steps, about resumes and schedules, and how nice it was to have help. And every word was a thread I could follow. I noticed how she stopped saying if and started saying when we get settled, when you adjust your hours, when this feels normal. She talked about my apartment like it was a shared resource that had finally been put to good use. Tessa followed her lead. The longer I stayed quiet, the bolder she got. She started leaving her things wherever she felt like. Her shoes by my door, her makeup on my bathroom counter, her laundry in my hamper. She asked me less and told me more, assuming my compliance the way people do when it's never been challenged. At one point, she said, "I'm glad you're not freaking out about this anymore," like that was a compliment. Like my silence was proof that everything was fine. I smiled and said it's just a lot to process, which was true in a way she didn't understand. What I didn't tell them was that pretending came easily because I had done it my whole life. I had learned early that reacting honestly only gave my mother something to fight. Calm, on the other hand, made her careless. Calm made her assume control was secure. There was a moment that afternoon that almost broke me. I was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, pretending to answer emails when my mother sat across from me and said, "You know, this is really good for you. Having people around. You get lonely." The word lonely landed softly, but it carried years of judgment with it. I felt my jaw tighten. I thought about my quiet evenings, my routines, the peace I had worked for. I thought about how often my mother equated solitude with failure. I could have snapped then. I could have told her that I wasn't lonely, I was rested. That being alone wasn't the same as being unwanted. That her need to fill space wasn't my problem. Instead, I nodded and said, "Maybe you're right." Her smile widened, satisfied. She reached across the table and patted my hand, like she had done when I was a child, when she believed she had corrected me. The gesture made my skin crawl, but I didn't pull away. Later, when she went out to run errands with Tessa, leaving Mason with me without asking, I took advantage of the quiet. Not to relax, but to look. Really look. I walked through my apartment slowly, like I was seeing it for the first time. I opened my hall closet and saw that half of it was already gone, pushed aside to make room for bins and jackets that weren't mine. I checked my bathroom cabinet and noticed items shifted space claimed. In my kitchen, I saw groceries I hadn't bought stacked neatly like they planned to stay. This wasn't improvisation. This was organization. I sat on my bed and let myself feel the anger I had been holding back. It came in waves, hot and sharp, but underneath it was something steadier. Resolve. Every small invasion, every assumption, every careless choice was confirming what I already knew. They weren't leaving because they didn't think they had to. When my mother and Tessa came back, I was ready. Not with confrontation, but with curiosity. I asked questions in a tone that sounded harmless. How long do you think this will take? What's your plan for next month? Have you thought about school schedules? They answered without hesitation, without caution. My mother said we'll see how things go, but her eyes flicked away when she said it. Tessa talked about interviews and maybe moving in the spring but not moving out. She talked about my apartment like it was a base camp, not a temporary shelter. At one point, my mother said we might need to get you another key cut just in case. The words slipped out like an afterthought, and then she laughed, brushing it off. I felt a cold jolt run through me. Another key. Another copy. Another layer of access. I kept my face neutral, but inside something clicked into place. She wasn't just comfortable crossing boundaries, she was expanding them. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat in the dark with my laptop open and didn't type a single word. I listened instead. To footsteps. To doors opening and closing. To the soft click of my front lock as my mother tested it before settling in a habit I pretended not to notice. I thought about the copied key again, about what it really meant. Physical access was one thing, but it was symbolic too. It was my mother's way of saying she didn't need permission, that my independence was conditional, that my space was only mine until she decided otherwise. I realized then that the key wasn't just a tool, it was a belief. A belief that she had permanent access to my life, that she could enter whenever she wanted and rearrange things to suit her needs. That belief was what I needed to break. The next day, I tested something small. My mother asked if I could cancel a meeting to watch Mason while she and Tessa went out together. I told her I couldn't calmly without explanation. Just can't today. She blinked, surprised. Then she smiled a little too tight and said, "We'll figure it out." She didn't push. Not yet. But I saw the calculation behind her eyes the way she filed the moment away. An hour later, she asked again, phrased differently. "Are you sure you can't move things around? It's just for a bit." I repeated myself. "I can't." She sighed dramatic and said, "Fine, we'll manage." And they did. Barely. With complaints and tension and pointed looks in my direction. I watched it all without reacting. The test confirmed what I needed to know. My no didn't register as a boundary. It registered as an inconvenience. That afternoon, I started keeping track. Not on paper yet, not officially, but in my head. Who said what? When assumptions were made? How often my consent was implied rather than asked for? It felt strange, almost sneaky, but it also felt necessary. I wasn't collecting ammunition, I was collecting clarity. That night, as I lay in bed listening to my apartment settle into uneasy quiet, I thought about how easy it would be to explode, to throw everything into chaos and demand respect. I knew that version of the story. It ended with me apologizing, with relationships frayed but unchanged, with my mother telling people I had overreacted. I didn't want that ending. I wanted something else. Something that didn't rely on her understanding or approval. Something that didn't require me to be louder than her. So I made the decision fully, without hesitation. I would keep pretending I didn't know. I would let them believe I had accepted this new normal. I would give them enough rope to show exactly how far they intended to go. Because the truth was already there, hiding in plain sight. They thought my silence meant surrender. They thought my calm meant compliance. They were wrong. And as I turned onto my side, staring at the faint outline of my bedroom door, I felt a strange sense of control settle over me. Not excitement, not triumph, just certainty. Whatever came next, I would be ready. The first quiet moment came by accident. Tessa took Mason to the park. My mother went out to meet a friend for coffee, and suddenly my apartment was mine again. Not fully, not safely, but empty enough to breathe. The silence felt unnatural, like a room after an argument where everyone has stormed out and the walls are still humming. I stood in the middle of my living room and let myself feel it. The quiet, the absence, the way my shoulders dropped without me telling them to. For a few seconds, I just closed my eyes and reminded myself what this space was supposed to feel like. Then I opened them and started looking. Not cleaning, not straightening. Looking. I walked slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you are trying not to miss anything important. I noticed the storage bins again, now tucked neatly against my wall like they had always belonged there. I noticed the stack of unopened mail on my counter mixed with envelopes that weren't mine. I noticed the way my desk chair had been adjusted, the height, changed, the seat pulled closer as if someone else had been working there regularly. None of it screamed emergency. All of it whispered intention. I went into my bedroom and opened my closet. Half of it was gone just like before, but now I looked closer. My coats pushed to one side, hangers doubled up. A pair of shoes I didn't recognize lined up on my shelf, carefully placed, not tossed. Someone had taken the time to settle in. My stomach tightened, not with panic, but with focus. This was no longer just about my feelings. This was about facts. I moved to my desk and opened my laptop, not because I knew exactly what I was looking for, but because something in me said the answer would not be in another argument. It would be in details, paperwork, rules, the kind of things my mother liked to ignore because they didn't bend to guilt. I pulled up my lease first. I hadn't read it cover to cover in a while, not since the day I signed it with shaking hands and hope I didn't fully trust yet. I scrolled slowly, reading words I had skimmed before. Occupancy limits, unauthorized residence, key duplication. My eyes stopped. No additional keys may be made or distributed without written consent from the property management. I read it again, then again. The words didn't change. A chill ran through me, slow and deliberate. My mother hadn't just crossed an emotional boundary. She had crossed a legal one. She had copied my apartment keys without permission, without notifying anyone, without thinking twice about what that meant for me. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't about being rude. This wasn't about family misunderstanding. This was about liability, safety, my name, my responsibility. I kept reading. Unauthorized occupants may result in lease termination or fines. My throat went dry. Unauthorized occupants, plural. My mother, Tessa, Mason. 3 people who were not on my lease, living here, using my utilities, occupying my space with my landlord, completely unaware. I felt something click into place then, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. This wasn't a situation that could just drift along until everyone got tired of it. This was something that could cost me my home. I sat there for a long moment, my heart beating steadily, my thoughts sharp. I replayed my mother's words in my head. We'll be here through the spring. It's practical. You're close to work. She hadn't just assumed I would help. She had assumed I would take the risk. I stood up and started opening drawers, not randomly, but with purpose. I checked the folder where I kept important documents. Everything was there, but it had been moved, rearranged. Someone had gone through it. Carefully, quietly, but undeniably. Anger flared, then hot and sudden. Not explosive, but cutting. She had gone through my paperwork, my lease, my personal information, and she had done it with the same justification she always used. I'm helping. I'm your mother. I know better. I paced the room. my bare feet cold against the floor. I wanted to scream. I wanted to call her and demand answers. I wanted to confront her with the lease in my hand and watch her squirm. Instead, I sat back down. Because I knew how that conversation would go. She would deny, minimize, accuse me of overreacting. She would cry. She would tell people I was being cruel. And worst of all, she would get careful. Right now, she thought she was safe. Right now, she was comfortable enough to make mistakes. I needed those mistakes. I opened my email next, searching for old messages from the property management company, maintenance notices, rent confirmations, anything that showed how seriously they took their rules. I found a reminder email from last year about guest policies firm and clear. They did not play around. My pulse picked up, but not with fear. With clarity. If my landlord found out about the copied key, about the unauthorized residence, about the access my mother had taken without consent, there would be consequences. Real ones. And those consequences wouldn't care about family dynamics or good intentions. I thought about the way my mother always talked about responsibility, about how she loved to remind me that my name was on things now that I had to be careful. Funny how that only applied when it benefited her. I heard the front door unlock and froze. Voices drifted in. Tessa and Mason laughing loud, dragging the day back in with them. I closed my laptop quickly and forced my body to relax. My heart was racing now, but I kept my face neutral. "Hey," Tessa called. "We're back." I stepped out of my room and smiled, a practiced thing. "How is the park?" She launched into a story about Mason climbing too high and scraping his knee. I listened. I nodded. I handed her a towel when she asked. All the while, my mind was somewhere else, rearranging itself around this new information. Later that evening, my mother returned flushed from coffee and conversation, carrying a bag of pastries she set on my counter without asking. She kissed my cheek and said, "See, doesn't this feel nice? All of us together." I looked at her and thought about the lease, about the keys, about the way she had risked my housing without telling me. And for the first time, I saw her not just as my mother, but as someone who had made a calculated choice. After dinner, when Mason was distracted with a movie, and Tessa was on the phone in the bedroom, my mother sat across from me at the table. She watched me with that familiar, assessing look. "You've been quiet," she said. "Are you okay?" I met her gaze and kept my voice soft. "I'm just tired," I said. "It's been a lot." She nodded, satisfied. "I knew it was overwhelming for you at first," she said. "But you always adjust. You're good at that." There it was again. The assumption. The certainty that I would bend. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked a question that felt innocent on the surface. "How long did you say you thought we'd all be here?" She didn't hesitate. "A few months," she said. "Until things stabilize. You don't mind, do you?" "A few months." The same phrase delivered casually, confidently. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I don't mind." The lie tasted bitter, but it served its purpose. Her shoulders relaxed. She smiled. She reached for my hand like she always did when she thought she had reassured me. "Good," she said. "I knew you'd understand." I understood perfectly. That night, after everyone went to bed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the lease open on my phone. The words burned into my mind. Unauthorized keys. Unauthorized occupants. Lease termination. I thought about what would happen if my landlord found out on his own. A noise complaint. A maintenance visit. A neighbor mentioning extra people. The risk wasn't hypothetical. It was real, and it was sitting in my living room. My mother had put my housing in jeopardy and expected me to absorb that risk quietly, the way I always had. I turned onto my side and looked at my keys on the nightstand, the familiar jingle, the weight I associated with independence, with adulthood. Somewhere out there was another copy cut without my knowledge in my mother's purse or Tessa's pocket. The thought made my skin prickle. I knew then that this was the detail that changed everything. Not the mess, not the entitlement, not even the planning. The fact that my mother had crossed into territory that could cost me my home meant this was no longer just a family issue. It meant I had leverage, and leverage used carefully could do what arguments never had. I didn't sleep much that night, but I didn't toss and turn either. My mind was steady, moving step by step through possibilities. I wasn't angry enough to act recklessly. I wasn't afraid enough to back down. I was ready to be careful. By morning, I had made another decision. I was not going to confront my mother with the lease. Not yet. I was not going to warn her. I was not going to tip my hand. Instead, I was going to find out exactly how much she had risked and exactly who needed to know. And once I knew that, I would decide my next move. I lay there listening to the apartment wake up around me. Voices, rising doors, opening life, continuing like nothing had changed. But everything had. And whatever came next, it would not be accidental. I carried the knowledge with me the way you carry something fragile, careful not to let it show, careful not to drop it in front of people who would only try to take it away. The least detail sat in my mind like a live wire. I could feel it humming under everything I did, every nod, every small favor, every neutral response. Nothing looked different on the outside, but inside the ground had shifted. The strange thing was how calm I felt. Not peaceful exactly, but steady. Like I had finally found the center of a problem that had always felt too big to hold. My mother moved through my apartment with confidence, talking loudly on the phone, making plans, assigning tasks. Tessa complained about how tired she was, how hard it was to be a single parent, how lucky I was to have stability. Mason left toys everywhere and looked at me automatically when he needed help. I helped. I listened. I smiled when appropriate. And all the while, I counted. I counted how many times my mother unlocked the door without hesitation, never fumbling, never asking. I counted how often Tessa referred to my place as home. I counted how many decisions were made as statements, not questions. They thought my silence meant acceptance. They didn't see it for what it was. Distance. The moment I decided to make the call came late in the afternoon, when the apartment finally emptied again. My mother took Tessa and Mason out for groceries, announcing they would be back soon, like that was something she had the authority to declare. The door shut behind them, and the quiet returned, thin but real. I didn't rush. I washed a few dishes. I wiped down the counter. I stood at my window and watched their car pull out of the lot. Only when I was sure I was alone did I sit down at my desk and open my laptop again. This time, I didn't reread the lease. I already knew it by heart. I searched instead for tenant resources in my city, guest policies, unauthorized access, key duplication, liability. The words were dry, legal, impersonal, and exactly what I needed. I learned that copying keys without consent was a violation, that allowing unauthorized occupants could void protections I relied on, that if something happened, damage, injury, a dispute, it would fall on me, not on my mother, not on my sister, on the name printed on the lease. I felt a familiar flicker of anger, but it burned out quickly, replaced by resolve. This was no longer about feelings. This was about protecting my life. I closed the browser and stared at the blank screen for a moment, my reflection faintly visible. I thought about calling my mother instead. About telling her I knew what she had done. About demanding she leave. I pictured the outcome with painful clarity. Tears. Accusations. Her telling me I was ungrateful. Her telling everyone else I had lost my mind. The situation escalating emotionally, but staying exactly the same structurally. That wasn't justice. That was noise. I picked up my phone and held it in my hand, feeling the weight of the decision. Once I made this call, there would be no pretending it was just a family misunderstanding. Someone else would be involved. someone who didn't care about guilt or tradition or how things looked from the outside. My thumb hovered over the screen. I thought about the version of myself from a year ago, from 5 years ago, from when I was a teenager wiping counters while everyone else had fun. That version would have swallowed this too. Would have told herself it was temporary. Would have waited until she broke. I wasn't her anymore. I stepped into my bedroom and closed the door, not because anyone was home, but because I needed the boundary to feel real. I sat on the edge of my bed and made the call. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize. I described the situation calmly, clearly sticking to facts. That I was the sole leaseholder. That keys had been copied without my consent. That people were living in my apartment who were not authorized. That I was concerned about my housing and my safety. There was a pause on the other end. Not the awkward kind, the attentive kind. I answered questions. Short answers. Dates. Names. How long they had been there. How many people. Whether I had given permission. I said no each time and felt a small sense of relief every time the word left my mouth without apology. At one point, the tone shifted. It became procedural. Serious. I felt my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with the understanding that this was real now. I was told what would happen next. That there would be a follow-up. That the situation would need to be verified. That someone would come by. I asked when. Soon, I was told. Very soon. I ended the call and sat there for a long moment, phone still in my hand. My heart was beating faster now, but it wasn't panic. It was adrenaline. The kind that comes when you step onto a path you know you can't turn away from. I hadn't told anyone. I wasn't going to. This wasn't something to announce or threaten with. This was a process that would unfold on its own. I stood up and paced the room once, twice, then forced myself to stop. I needed to be careful now. Any slip, any hint, and my mother would sense it. She always did. When they came back, arms full of grocery bags, I took one from Tessa automatically. My mother smiled at me, pleased. See, she said, teamwork. This is working. I nodded. It is. The words felt strange in my mouth, not because they were untrue, but because of what they meant. This was working, just not the way she thought. That night, as we unpacked groceries, my mother talked about the coming week. Appointments, errands, plans that included me without ever saying my name. Tessa chimed in, listing things she needed help with, assuming my availability like it was a constant. I listened and said as little as possible. I watched my mother closely. I noticed how relaxed she looked, how secure. The copied key rested in her purse somewhere, I was sure of it, a silent symbol of her confidence. Later, when Mason was asleep and Tessa was in the shower, my mother sat beside me on the couch. She leaned back, sighing contentedly. I know this wasn't what you planned, she said, but you're handling it well. I'm proud of you. Proud. The word slid over me without sticking. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw how convinced she was that she still held the reins. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I let her have that moment because it would make what came next hit harder. When I went to bed, I didn't sleep right away. I lay there listening to the sounds of my apartment, now familiar and foreign at the same time. My mind ran through scenarios, not catastrophes, but logistics. What would my mother say when she realized someone else was involved? Would she blame me or herself? Would she try to talk her way out of it? Would she understand what she had risked? I didn't know. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need to know. The next day, nothing happened. No knock. No call. The waiting stretched thin and tense. My mother grew more animated, more confident, talking about rearranging furniture, about school enrollment options, about how nice it was to feel settled. Each word tightened the coil in my chest. On the second day, I felt it. That sense of time narrowing, of something moving toward us, unseen but inevitable. I found myself listening for sounds I hadn't before. The elevator, footsteps in the hallway, a knock that hadn't come yet. I kept playing my part. I went to work. I came home. I helped. I nodded. I stayed neutral. Inside, I was braced. That evening, as I washed dishes, my mother stood beside me and said we should talk about extending this arrangement, making it official. She said official like it was a comfort, not a threat. I turned off the water and looked at her, my face calm. "We'll see," I said. "Let's take things one step at a time." She smiled, reassured, and patted my arm. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something important. I wasn't scared of the confrontation anymore. I was ready for it. Ready for the questions. Ready for the fallout. Ready for the loss if that was the cost. Because the truth was already out there, now moving toward us with its own momentum. I had handed it off to people who dealt in facts, not feelings. All I had to do was wait. And wait. I did, listening to the quiet moments between noise, aware that the next sound I was listening for would change everything. The knock came on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of ordinary weekday that lulls you into thinking nothing important will happen. I was in the kitchen rinsing a mug when the sound cut through the apartment. Firm, deliberate. Not the casual knock of a neighbor, not the lazy tap of someone who expected to be let in. My hands froze under the running water. For a second, no one moved. Then my mother's voice floated in from the living room, light and confident. "I'll get it." Something in her tone told me she thought it was a delivery or a maintenance issue, something routine, something she could handle. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands slowly, my heart beating harder now, not with fear, but with anticipation I hadn't fully allowed myself to feel until that moment. She opened the door. I heard the shift immediately. The polite greeting that stopped halfway through. The pause. The subtle tightening in her voice when she said hello. I stepped into the hallway just as two uniformed officers came into view, their presence filling the doorway in a way that made my apartment feel smaller, sharper. Behind them stood a man in a jacket with the property management logo stitched on the chest. My mother's face went pale in stages, like color draining from a photograph. "Is there a problem?" she asked, trying to smile, trying to sound in control. One of the officers glanced at his partner, then looked past my mother into the apartment, eyes scanning quickly. "We received a call regarding unauthorized access and occupancy at this address," he said. "We need to speak with the leaseholder." My mother turned toward me slowly, her smile slipping. "Leaseholder." I stepped forward. "That's me," I said, my voice steady. Her eyes widened just enough to betray her shock. "Harper, what is this?" She laughed softly, the sound brittle. "This must be some kind of misunderstanding." The officer nodded politely. "That's what we're here to clarify." They stepped inside, not aggressively, not rudely, but with authority that didn't ask permission. The man from property management followed, clipboard in hand, his expression neutral but alert. Tessa emerged from the bedroom, Mason trailing behind her, confusion written across both their faces. "What's going on?" Tessa asked, her voice sharp with irritation that quickly turned to alarm when she saw the uniforms. My mother reached for control immediately. "There's no issue," she said. "We're family. We're just visiting." The officer looked at me again. "How many people are currently residing here?" I answered without hesitation. 3 adults and 1 child. "And how many are listed on the lease?" "1, I said. Silence settled over the room like a held breath. The property manager flipped through his clipboard. "According to our records, only 1 key was issued for this unit," he said. "We have reason to believe additional keys were duplicated without authorization." My mother's head snapped toward him. "That's ridiculous," she said. "I'm her mother. I had a key for emergencies." The officer raised a hand gently. "Ma'am, we'll need to ask you some questions. When did you receive this key?" She hesitated. I saw it clearly the moment where she realized she couldn't spin this away easily. A while ago, she said. She gave it to me. I shook my head. I didn't. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. My mother stared at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Harper, she said sharply, don't do this. Do what I asked quietly. Tell the truth. The officer turned to her again. Did you duplicate this key? Her mouth opened, then closed. Tessa stepped forward. Mom, what did you do? My mother's shoulders stiffened. I did what I had to do, she snapped. My daughter needed help. You think I was going to let her struggle when she has space? The property manager scribbled something down. Ma'am, duplicating keys without consent is a violation of the lease agreement. Allowing unauthorized occupants is also a violation. My mother laughed again, louder this time, a sharp sound. This is absurd. She's my daughter. This is family business. The officer's expression didn't change. This is a housing matter with potential legal implications, he said. Family relationships don't override tenancy laws. Mason started to cry, the sound thin and scared. Tessa crouched down beside him, whispering something I couldn't hear, her hands shaking. I felt a twist in my chest at the sight, guilt flaring for just a second, but it burned away quickly. None of this was happening because of the child. It was happening because the adults had made choices. The officer turned back to me. Did you give permission for these individuals to reside here? No, I said. Did you give permission for keys to be copied? No. My mother let out a sound somewhere between a gasp and a scoff. I can't believe you, she said. You called the police on your own family. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. I asked for help because my housing was at risk, I said. You put it at risk without asking me. The room felt too small now. The walls too close. The property manager cleared his throat. Given the circumstances, he said, we'll need to document this as an unauthorized occupancy and key violation. The leaseholder may be subject to review, but primary responsibility will fall on the individual who duplicated the key. My mother's face went white. What does that mean? It means, the officer said calmly, that you will need to vacate the premises immediately. Any copied keys must be surrendered. This is insane, my mother said. We have nowhere to go right now. Tessa looked up at her, panic flooding her face. Mom. The officer's voice softened slightly, but his words did not. You can gather essential belongings, he said. But you cannot remain here. My mother turned on me then, her composure cracking. You did this on purpose, she hissed. You humiliated me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I said one sentence. You broke into my home and tried to move your life into it without my consent. Her mouth trembled. She looked around the apartment like she was seeing it for the first time, not as something she could control, but as something that was slipping away. The officers stood quietly while Tessa packed a bag with shaking hands, while my mother moved stiffly, grabbing her purse, pulling out a set of keys. She held them out like they burned. Here, she said, thrusting them toward the officer. He took them and handed them to me. I wrapped my fingers around the metal, feeling their familiar weight, heavier now with meaning. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through my chest. I stood there in the sudden silence, my apartment feeling different again, stripped of noise, stripped of tension. The officers asked a few final questions, the property manager explained next steps. Then they were gone too. When the door shut for the last time, I leaned against it and slid down until I was sitting on the floor, keys clutched in my hand, my breath coming in shaky bursts. I wasn't crying. Not yet. I was just breathing. The quiet pressed in around me, not empty but full. Full of consequence. Full of loss. Full of something like relief. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know how my mother would spin this story or how long it would take before she tried to rewrite it. But for the first time in my life, the story in my home was mine again. And as I sat there on the floor listening to my own breath steady, I knew this was only the beginning of what would come next. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the chaos that came before. Not empty, not peaceful, just dense like the air after a storm when everything is wet and exposed. I sat on the floor for a long time after the door closed my back against it, the keys still warm in my hand. When I finally stood up, my legs were stiff, my balance off, like I had been holding myself together too tightly and forgot how to let go. I walked through the apartment slowly, not to check for damage, not to clean, just to see it again without the minute. The couch cushions were dented, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and something sweet. Mason's toy car sat under the table where it had been kicked and forgotten. Evidence, not of violence or malice, but of presence. Of how quickly a space could be overtaken when you were trained not to protest. I picked up the toy car and set it by the door, then stopped. I didn't owe anyone neatness. I didn't owe anyone readiness for their return. I set it back down and kept walking. My phone buzzed on the counter. I hadn't noticed it before. 3 missed calls. 2 texts. All from my mother. I didn't open them. Instead, I filled a glass with water and drank it, standing up, staring out the window at the parking lot below. Their car was gone. The spot where it had been sat empty, just oil stains and a scrap of paper blowing in the wind. A strange laugh bubbled up in my chest, sharp and unexpected. I pressed my lips together until it passed. Relief and grief have a way of sharing space, stepping on each other's toes. The next call came 20 minutes later. I let it ring. Then another. Then a voicemail. I finally picked up my phone and turned it face down on the counter like it might bite me if I looked at it too soon. That evening, the property manager emailed me. The tone was professional, neutral, almost kind. They acknowledged the situation, thanked me for reporting it, confirmed that the copied keys had been confiscated and that the incident would be documented. There would be a review. I might be contacted. For now, my tenancy remained intact. Tenancy remained intact. I read that line 3 times, my shoulders sagging each time until I realized how much tension I had been carrying without noticing. My home was still mine. That fact alone felt like a small miracle. I replied with a brief thank you and closed my laptop. Night came quietly. No cartoons, no whispered phone calls, no footsteps outside my bedroom door. I ate a simple dinner standing at the counter because sitting at the table felt too loaded. I showered and let the hot water run longer than usual, watching the steam cloud the mirror until my reflection disappeared. When I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion hit me all at once, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes your thoughts heavy. I slept deeply, dreamlessly until my phone buzzed again at 6 in the morning. This time, it wasn't my mother. It was my sister. I stared at the name on the screen until it stopped buzzing. Then I stared some more. I didn't know which version of her would be on the other end. The angry one. The desperate one. The one who would pretend none of this was really about me. She called again. I let it go to voicemail. An hour later, my mother texted, "You didn't have to do that. You embarrassed me in front of strangers. We could have handled this like adults." I felt my jaw tighten. Like adults. The irony was almost impressive. I typed a response, then erased it. Typed again, erased again. There was no sentence that wouldn't turn into an argument. No explanation that wouldn't be twisted into an attack. So I didn't respond at all. Instead, I went to work. It felt surreal sitting at my desk answering emails, chatting about weekend plans with coworkers who had no idea that my life had cracked open the day before. The normalcy felt fake at first, like I was play-acting someone else's routine. But as the hours passed, something settled. This was my life. This part of it was still intact too. During lunch, I checked my phone. More messages. Longer now. My mother explaining her side. How she was just trying to help. How she felt betrayed. How she had told everyone that I was overwhelmed and needed support, and now she looked like a criminal. Criminal. I closed the messages without replying. That evening, I came home to silence again. Real silence this time, not the tense kind. I kicked off my shoes and stood in the entryway listening. Nothing. I smiled before I could stop myself. I made tea and sat on the couch, legs tucked under me, mug warm in my hands. This was how I used to spend my evenings. Quiet, thoughtful, alone, but not lonely. The knock at the door startled me anyway. I froze, my heart jumping, then laughed softly at myself. Of course I would still flinch. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Tessa. She stood there alone, eyes red, arms crossed tight around herself. No bags. No Mason. I didn't open the door right away. I took a breath, grounded myself, then unlocked it and opened it just enough to step into the doorway, keeping the chain on. "What do you want?" I asked. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked past me into the apartment like she was expecting to see our mother emerge from the shadows. When she didn't, she swallowed. "Can we talk?" she said. "Just for a minute." I considered it. Not her feelings. Not her need. My own capacity. "5 minutes," I said. "Here." She nodded, relief flashing across her face. I stepped aside enough for her to stand in the hallway, but not enough to let her in. She looked smaller than I remembered. Less certain. Anger flickered across her face, then something else underneath it. Fear. "Mom's a mess," she said. "She's furious. She keeps saying you set her up." I held her gaze. I didn't interrupt. "She says you went behind her back," Tessa continued. "That you called people to scare her. That you could have just talked to her." I felt the familiar urge to defend myself, to lay out the facts, to prove my innocence like I had been trained to do. I let it pass. "Did you know she copied my keys?" I asked instead. Tessa hesitated. Then she shook her head. "Not like that," she said. "She said you gave them to her." I nodded slowly. "Did you know she planned to stay through the spring?" Her eyes widened. "She didn't say spring." I let that sit between us. Tessa rubbed her arms, suddenly cold. "She didn't tell me everything either," she said. "She just said it would be fine. That you'd help. That you always do." There it was. The truth she hadn't wanted to name. "I'm not mad at you," I said quietly. "But I'm done being volunteered." Her eyes filled to my surprise. "I didn't think it was that bad," she said. "I thought you were just stressed." "I needed help." "I know," I said. "But needing help doesn't mean taking someone else's home." She nodded slowly, shame creeping into her expression. "Mom doesn't see it that way," she said. "She thinks family should just make room." I looked at my door, at the chain between us, solid and visible. "Making room doesn't mean erasing someone," I said. We stood there for a moment, the hallway quiet around us. She took a breath. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "For my part in it. I should have asked you. I should have listened when you were uncomfortable." The apology wasn't perfect. It didn't fix everything. But it was real enough that my chest loosened a little. "Thank you," I said. She wiped her eyes. "I'm staying with a friend for now," she said. "Mom found a cheap motel. She keeps talking about calling a lawyer." I didn't react. That was her right. Her choice. Tessa glanced up at me, searching my face. "Are you going to press charges or something?" "No," I said. "I just wanted my home back." She nodded like she had expected something worse. After a moment, she stepped back. "I'll tell her to stop calling you," she said. "At least for now." I didn't promise anything in return. When she left, I closed the door and locked it, then leaned against it, breathing out slowly. That conversation had cost me more than I expected. Not because it was hostile, but because it was sad. Because it confirmed something I had always known. My mother didn't just take from me. She taught others it was acceptable. That night, I finally listened to the voicemail she had left. Her voice was tight, wounded, angry. She talked about respect, about loyalty, about how she had sacrificed everything for her children, about how she couldn't believe I would choose strangers over blood. She didn't mention the keys. She didn't mention the lease. She didn't mention my consent. I deleted it. Over the next few days, the messages slowed, then stopped. The silence shifted again from shock to something colder. Distance. I spent those days reclaiming my space. Not dramatically. Gently. I moved my furniture back where I liked it. I washed everything. I aired out the rooms. I changed the locks. The locksmith was professional quick. He asked if I wanted extra copies made. No, I said. Just one. When he handed me the new key, I felt something close to pride. Not in the metal, but in what it represented. I placed it in the bowl by the door that night alone again in my apartment, the quiet settling around me like a familiar blanket. I knew this wasn't over. I knew my mother would rewrite the story, paint herself as the victim, wait for the moment she could pull me back in. But as I sat there, tea cooling in my hands, my space finally mine again, I felt something solid under my ribs. I had chosen myself. And whatever came next, I would meet it from here. The first time I heard my mother's voice again, it wasn't through a voicemail or a text. It was through my hallway wall, sharp and familiar, like a knife I used to live with tucked under my pillow. I was standing in my kitchen rinsing a plate when I caught it, muffled but unmistakable, my name carried through the crack under my front door. "Harper, open up." She called louder the second time, like volume could turn a locked door into a suggestion. My stomach dropped anyway. Not because I wanted to let her in, but because my body still remembered what it meant to be summoned. Old wiring. Years of being trained that ignoring her was dangerous, that silence would be punished. I dried my hands slowly and walked to the door. I didn't touch the lock. I didn't put my eye to the peephole. I just stood there listening. There was a metallic scrape, the sound of a key, meeting a lock. It didn't belong to anymore. She tried once, twice. Harder the third time, the handle rattling, her breath audible even through the door. "What did you do to the lock?" she snapped, like the lock had personally offended her. I rested my forehead lightly against the door, not in defeat, just in steadiness. "I changed it," I said, keeping my voice level. "You don't have a key." A beat of silence, then the air shifted. I could feel her anger gather like a storm. "You think you can shut me out?" she said. "After everything I have done for you." I didn't answer. I wasn't going to debate my right to be safe in my own home. I wasn't going to defend a boundary as if it were a crime. Her voice rose. "Open the door, Harper. We are going to talk like adults." Like adults. The same phrase she'd used when she wanted me to behave while she refused to. I heard another sound, softer. Footsteps. A neighbor's door opening. Someone pausing to listen. The building had always been quiet, the kind of place where people mostly minded their business, but it's hard to ignore a scene happening right outside your door. My mother noticed it too. Her tone changed instantly, sweeter, louder, designed for an audience. "I am just trying to speak to my daughter," she announced. "She is having a little episode." My throat tightened. There it was. The old rewrite, the one that turned my boundaries into instability, my calm into a problem to be managed. I stepped back from the door and looked around my apartment. Everything was normal. Clean counters, soft lamplight, my keys in the bowl by the entryway, one key, one life. The contrast made me almost laugh. My phone was on the counter. I picked it up not as a threat, not as a weapon, but as a tool. I had promised myself I would stop handling this the way she wanted, privately, emotionally, in a way that left me isolated. I had promised myself I would stop absorbing the impact. I opened my building's resident portal and pulled up the after-hours number for property management, the one I had saved after the first incident. My thumb hovered, then pressed. When someone answered, I spoke quietly. I explained that my former co-occupant was outside my door attempting to enter, that she was not authorized, that she had previously duplicated keys without consent and had been removed. I asked what I should do. The voice on the other end didn't sound surprised. They told me to stay inside, not engage, and call law enforcement if she refused to leave. I ended the call and stared at the door for a long moment. My mother was still out there, still talking, still trying to control the story. I could hear her footsteps shifting the way she paced when she was building her argument. "Harper," she said again. "Lower now, more dangerous. Don't make me do this in front of people." It took everything in me not to respond with the truth, which was that she had already done it in front of people. She had already dragged strangers into it when she showed up here insisting my home was hers to access. Instead, I did what the person on the phone told me. I called. My hands didn't shake until after I pressed the last digit. The shaking came when it started ringing like my body finally caught up to what my mind had decided. When I described what was happening, the dispatcher asked if my mother was threatening me physically. I said no. Then I said something that felt strange and powerful at the same time. "She is trying to force entry. She does not live here, and she has a history of unauthorized key duplication." History. Even saying it that way reframed it. This wasn't a one-time family spat. This was a pattern. I hung up and stood by my window peeking through the blinds. I could see my mother in the hallway, arms crossed, chin lifted as if she was waiting for someone to come agree with her. She looked composed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her mouth. A minute later, Tessa appeared at the end of the hallway. She looked panicked, hair pulled back, face blotchy like she'd been crying. She rushed toward our door, then slowed when she saw me wasn't opening it. "Mom," she hissed, keeping her voice low. "You need to stop. Just stop." My mother rounded on her. "Don't tell me what to do. Your sister has lost her mind, and I am not going to let her destroy this family." Tessa's eyes flicked to my door, then away. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the carpet. She sounded smaller when she spoke again. "She changed the locks, Mom. You can't just come here." My mother laughed harsh. "Can't. Watch me." Tessa grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back. "Mom, please. The building is watching." That was always the thing that mattered to her. Not my peace, not my safety. The building, the neighbors, the image. For a second, my mother's gaze shifted, scanning the hallway like she suddenly remembered she was on a stage. She straightened, smoothed her hair, and raised her voice again. Performing. "My daughter is refusing to speak to me," she said, loud and wounded. "She called the police on us last time, and now she is doing it again." Tessa's face crumpled. She whispered something I couldn't hear. My mother waved her off. I didn't open the door. I didn't argue through it. I stayed inside and let the reality be what it was. When the officers arrived, the hallway quieted in that instant way it does when authority enters a space. I heard their voices, first calm and professional. I heard my mother's tone transform again, trying to sound cooperative, reasonable, confused. I moved closer to the door and opened it a few inches, keeping myself behind it. One of the officers recognized me. He didn't look surprised, just tired in a way that made my chest tighten with shame I didn't deserve. "Ma'am," he said, "are you the resident here?" "Yes," I said. "And the woman in the hallway is your mother?" "Yes," I said again. "She does not live here. She does not have permission to enter." I changed the locks. My mother stepped forward, immediately, palms out. "Officer, this is ridiculous. I am her mother. She is having some kind of breakdown. She is being cruel. I just want to talk." The officer held up a hand gently. "Ma'am, this is not about family relationship. This is about residence and access. Are you on the lease?" My mother's mouth tightened. "No," she said. "But I have a right." "No," the officer said, steady. "You don't." Tessa stood a few feet behind her, eyes wide, shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself invisible. The officer turned back to me. "Do you want to issue a formal trespass warning?" The words landed with weight. Formal. Trespass. Warning. I felt my throat tighten because part of me still wanted this to be resolved with a simple conversation, a reasonable apology, a reset. The part of me that still hoped my mother would suddenly become someone else. But another part of me, the part that had read the lease in the dark, the part that had watched officers walk through my living room, knew this was exactly why it kept happening. Because every time she crossed a line, I tried to fix it privately. Every time she was given a soft landing, she learned she could jump again. I took a breath. "Yes," I said. "I do." My mother's face snapped toward me, eyes blazing. "You cannot do that. You cannot treat your own mother like a criminal." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I said a single sentence, slow and clear. "You treated my home like it belonged to you." That was it. That was the truth she couldn't rewrite. The officer explained the warning. He used simple language. "You are not allowed to return to this property. If you do, you can be arrested." He asked for her ID. He took notes. He made it official. My mother tried to interrupt, tried to argue, tried to charm. It didn't matter. Paper didn't care about charm. She turned to Tessa as if she expected backup. "Tell them," she said, "tell them I am not a threat." Tessa's mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes filled with tears and she looked at the floor. "I can't," she whispered. "Not after what you did." The words barely carried, but they hit like a crack in glass. My mother's face stiffened, shocked more by the betrayal of Tessa's quiet honesty than by the officer's warning. The officer finished his explanation and asked my mother if she understood. She nodded sharply, lips pressed together, refusing to give them the satisfaction of more words. Then she looked at me, and for a moment I saw something raw behind her anger. Not remorse, not understanding, fear. The fear of losing control. "You're going to regret this," she said low enough that the officers didn't react. She leaned in like she wanted the words to lodge under my skin. "One day, when you need someone, you'll remember this." I didn't flinch. I held her gaze and let the silence answer for me. The officers walked her toward the stairwell. Tessa followed, wiping her cheeks, shoulders shaking. Before she disappeared around the corner, she looked back at me, eyes pleading, as if she wanted me to promise something: forgiveness, reconciliation, some easy path back to normal. I gave her a small nod. Not forgiveness, not permission, just acknowledgement. "I saw you. I heard you." I wasn't going to punish her for stepping out of our mother's shadow, not when I knew how hard that was. When the hallway finally emptied, one of the officers stayed behind to speak to me. His tone softened slightly, the way it does when someone is trying to be kind without crossing a professional line. "This is the best way to handle it," he said. "Clear boundaries. No more contact at the residence. If she returns, call again." I nodded. "Thank you," I said. He left, and the building fell quiet again. The normal quiet, the kind that made everything feel almost unreal. I locked my door and leaned against it, breathing slowly. My hands were shaking now, finally. Not because I was afraid she'd hurt me, but because I had done something that felt impossible for most of my life. I had put it in writing. I had made it official. I had taken her access away in a way she couldn't guilt-trip her way around. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother already. "You have destroyed this family. Do not call me when you are old and alone." I stared at the screen, the words familiar in their cruelty. Then I did something I had never done before. I blocked her number. My chest tightened as if the act itself was physical, like I had slammed a door and turned the deadbolt. I sat down on the floor right there in the entryway and let myself feel the aftershock. I thought about Mason, about how this would ripple into his life. I thought about Tessa, about how lost she looked. I thought about my mother, about her fear turning into rage, about the stories she would tell anyone who would listen. Then I thought about myself, about the version of me who used to believe love meant endurance, who used to believe being a good daughter meant being endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly quiet. I wasn't her anymore. I couldn't be not, if I wanted a life that belonged to me. I stood up, went to the kitchen, and made tea with hands that still trembled. I carried the mug to my couch and sat down, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. Outside my window, the parking lot lights flickered on one by one, ordinary and steady. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. I felt sad. I felt clean in a way I didn't have a better word for, like I had finally rinsed something off my skin that had been there for years. And as the evening settled around me, I knew the next part wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be uniforms and clipboards. It would be the fallout, the phone calls to relatives, the social media whispers, the version of the story my mother would try to sell. But for now, in this moment, in this quiet apartment with a new lock and a blocked number, I let myself sit still and breathe, because I had done what I needed to do, and I was ready for whatever came after. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It crept in sideways through other people's mouths, through screens and secondhand stories, through the subtle shift in how my phone felt heavier even when it was quiet. I woke up the morning after blocking my mother's number with a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes when you know you've crossed a line you can't uncross, and you've decided to stand on the other side of it. I made coffee and drank it slowly, standing by the window watching the same ordinary view I had seen 1,000 times before. Nothing outside had changed. Cars came and went. Someone walked their dog. Life continued without consulting my family drama. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made the next part harder, because it meant I had to live inside the consequences without the distraction of crisis. The first message came from my aunt. A long paragraph carefully worded, full of concern. "Your mom is beside herself. She says you called the police on her. She's worried about you. Are you okay?" I read it twice, then set my phone down. I didn't respond right away. I wanted to answer honestly, but I also didn't want to be dragged into another explanation that would get filtered and reshaped by someone else's loyalty. An hour later, a cousin texted, "I heard things are rough. Families fight, but this seems extreme." Extreme. That word again. The one people use when boundaries make them uncomfortable. By lunchtime, there were more. A friend request from someone I barely spoke to anymore. A message from my brother, short and clipped. "Mom says you've shut her out completely. That's cold." I stared at that one longer than the others. Cold. As if warmth had ever flowed both ways. As if my home hadn't been invaded. As if saying no hadn't been ignored until there was no soft option left. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another. In the end, I sent one sentence. I didn't shut her out. I protected my home. No reply came back. At work, I found it harder to concentrate. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind kept looping through conversations that hadn't happened yet. The family meeting that would never be scheduled. The apology that would never sound right. The version of events my mother was surely rehearsing with anyone who would listen. I imagined her sitting in a motel room or at a cheap diner telling the story the way she needed it to be told. Leaving out the copied keys. Leaving out the lease. Leaving out my no. Framing herself as the worried mother dealing with an ungrateful daughter who had gone too far. She had always been good at that. At controlling the narrative by controlling what information was allowed to exist. I went home early that day, not because I was sick, but because I needed to be in my space. I needed to sit on my couch and remind myself that I wasn't imagining things, that the locks were changed, that the door stayed shut because I chose it to. When I got there, I found a piece of paper taped to my door. For a second, my heart leapt into my throat. Old fear, old instinct. I ripped it down quickly, half expecting it to be something from my mother, a note dripping with guilt and accusation. It was from the building management. A brief notice thanking me for my cooperation, reminding me to contact them if there were any further issues. Professional, neutral, closed. I laughed, then a soft sound that surprised me. Even the building treated this with more respect than my own family had. That night, my sister called from a blocked number. I recognized her voice the second I answered, tired and raw. "I know you blocked Mom," she said. "She made me try from my phone." I sighed, leaning back on the couch. "I didn't block you," I said. "I know." There was a pause. "She's not doing well." I let the silence stretch. I wasn't going to rush to fill it with reassurance. "She keeps saying you ruined her life," Tessa continued. "That you made her look unstable. That people are judging her." I closed my eyes. People judging her was never about me. It was about her fear of losing the image she had built her whole identity on. "What do you want me to do?" I asked quietly. Another pause. "I don't know," she admitted. I didn't think it would go this far." "Neither did I said. "But it did." She sniffed. "I'm staying with a friend. Mom keeps talking about how she doesn't recognize you anymore." I almost laughed. I didn't recognize myself for a long time either. Tessa's voice dropped. "She keeps asking what she did wrong." That was the moment I felt the familiar pull, the urge to soften things, to make it easier for everyone to take responsibility for explaining my mother's own behavior to her. The urge that had shaped so much of my life. I resisted it. "You can tell her what she did wrong if you want," I said. "But I already tried. I'm not doing it again." Tessa didn't argue. That alone told me how much things had shifted. She was quiet for a long moment, then said something that surprised me. "She never listens when you say no," she said. "I guess I just never thought about what that meant for you." I swallowed. "Thank you for saying that." After we hung up, I sat there in the dim light, thinking about how many people in my family had benefited from my silence without ever acknowledging its cost. How many times my discomfort had been treated as an acceptable expense. The next few days were like that. Messages arriving, then slowing, then arriving again. Each one an attempt to pull me back into the old role, the fixer, the explainer, the reasonable one. I stopped responding to most of them. Instead, I wrote. Not letters to my family, notes to myself. Pages and pages in a notebook I kept by my bed. I wrote down what had happened in plain language without drama. My mother copied my keys. My mother moved people into my apartment without permission. I said no. She ignored me. I protected my home. I wrote down how it made me feel. Not just angry or hurt, but small, replaceable. Like my life was a resource to be allocated. I wrote down what I wanted going forward. No surprise visits, no access without consent, no conversations that turned into interrogations, no being volunteered. Seeing it on paper made it harder to gaslight myself. Harder to slip back into doubt when someone asked, "Are you sure it was that bad?" Yes, I was sure. It was written down. One afternoon, my brother showed up unannounced. Not at my door, but at my building, calling from the parking lot. Like that made it better. I didn't invite him up. We stood outside, the air sharp, the space public enough to keep things contained. He looked uncomfortable, hands shoved into his pockets. "Mom's been calling everyone," he said. "She's saying you overreacted." I met his gaze. "Did she mention the copied keys?" He hesitated. "No." "Did she mention the lease violation?" He looked away. "No." I nodded. "That's why I'm done explaining." He sighed, rubbing his face. "She's your mother." "I know," I said. "That's why it took me so long to stop her." He didn't have an answer for that. He shifted his weight, clearly torn between loyalty and logic. "She says she was just trying to help," he said finally. I laughed not kindly. Help doesn't involve breaking into someone's home. He flinched at the word breaking like it was too harsh, but it was accurate. We stood there in silence, the gap between us filled with years of unspoken expectation. Finally, he spoke again. She wants to know if you'll talk to her. I shook my head. Not right now. When then? I thought about it. Not because I owed him an answer, but because I owed myself honesty. When she can acknowledge what she did without blaming me for it, I said. When she can accept boundaries without treating them like betrayal. He nodded slowly like he was filing that away for later, though I wasn't sure he believed it would ever happen. That night alone again in my apartment, I cooked dinner and ate it at my table, not standing, not rushed. I let myself enjoy the quiet, the way my shoulders no longer jumped at footsteps, the way my phone felt lighter when it stayed face down. I knew the story my mother was telling would spread. I knew some people would believe her. I knew I would be painted as cold, dramatic, ungrateful. That hurt. I won't pretend it didn't. Being misunderstood by strangers is one thing. Being misunderstood by people who watched you grow up cuts deeper. But there was something else underneath that hurt now. A steadiness. A sense that even if the entire extended family decided I was the villain, I could live with that if it meant I didn't have to live with fear in my own home. I went to bed that night thinking about how strange it was that choosing myself had made my world smaller in some ways and bigger in others. Fewer phone calls, fewer obligations, fewer expectations, more room to breathe. As I drifted toward sleep, I realized something important. The worst part wasn't losing my mother's approval. It was realizing how conditional it had always been. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The next part wouldn't be about confrontation or police or locks. It would be about rebuilding something quieter and harder. A life where my boundaries weren't constantly under negotiation. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady hum of the building around me, and let myself rest, knowing the storm had passed, and the work ahead would be different, slower, and entirely mine. Rebuilding didn't happen in one dramatic moment. It crept in quietly, disguised as ordinary days that felt a little less heavy than the ones before. I woke up without bracing myself for messages. I came home without scanning the hallway for familiar footsteps. My life didn't suddenly become peaceful, but it became mine again, and that changed the way everything felt. I started small. I rearranged my living room not because it needed it, but because I wanted to erase the shape of where they had been. I moved the couch closer to the window, angled the chair toward the bookshelf, rolled up the rug, and cleaned the floor underneath. With every shift, it felt like I was reclaiming inches of myself that had been quietly taken. I cooked again, real meals, not the kind you throw together because someone else needs to eat. I played music while I chopped vegetables. I ate at the table with a book propped open, letting silence exist without filling it with someone else's voice. At night, I slept deeper than I had in years. The first time my mother tried to reach me again wasn't through a call or a text. It was through someone else. An envelope appeared in my mailbox, my name written in her familiar looping handwriting. My stomach clenched at the sight of it, the old reflex kicking in before I could stop it. I carried it upstairs and set it on the counter. I didn't open it right away. I made tea first. I sat down. I breathed. Then I opened it. The letter was long. Of course it was. My mother never did anything halfway when it came to words. She wrote about her hurt, her confusion, how blindsided she felt. She wrote about how she had only wanted to help, how she couldn't believe I would take things so far. She wrote about family loyalty, about how much she had sacrificed, about how I had embarrassed her in front of people who mattered. She did not write the words, "I'm sorry." She did not write, "I was wrong." She did not write, "I crossed a line." Instead, she ended with, "I hope someday you come to your senses and remember who has always been there for you." I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. My hands were steady. That surprised me more than anything. I didn't feel the urge to respond. not because it didn't hurt, but because it told me everything I needed to know. She still believed this was a misunderstanding, a disagreement between equals, something that could be smoothed over if I just came back into alignment. I wasn't going to do that. I didn't throw the letter away. I put it in the notebook where I had been writing, right behind the pages where I had documented what happened. Not as evidence for anyone else, but as a reminder for myself. A few days later, Tessa asked if we could meet. Coffee, she said. Just us. I agreed, but I chose the place. A small cafe near my apartment, busy enough that voices blended together, public enough that neither of us could explode without an audience. I arrived early and sat with my back to the wall, the way I always did now, scanning the room until I spotted her. She looked tired. Not the dramatic, overwhelmed tired she used to perform, but a quieter one, like someone who hadn't slept well in a while. She sat down across from me and wrapped her hands around her cup. "Mom's still angry," she said, not meeting my eyes. "She keeps saying you owe her an apology." I stirred my coffee. "I don't owe her anything." Tessa nodded slowly. "I know." She hesitated, then added, "She's also scared." That made me look up. "Scared of what?" "Of losing control," she said, then winced like she hadn't meant to say it that plainly. She sighed. "Of losing you. Of people seeing her differently. Of not being needed the way she used to be." I listened without interrupting. This was new. Tessa naming things without asking me to fix them. She took a breath. "I didn't realize how much she leaned on you," she said. "How much all of us did. When everything blew up, it felt sudden to me, but I keep thinking about how long it must have been building for you." Tears pricked my eyes, unexpected and sharp. I blinked them away. "It took a long time," I said. "I just didn't have words for it back then." She nodded. "I'm not asking you to forgive her," she said carefully. "I just wanted you to know that I see it now, and I'm sorry I didn't before." That apology landed differently than my mother's letter. It didn't erase the past, but it softened something in my chest. It reminded me that patterns can be inherited, but they can also be interrupted. We sat there for a while, talking about neutral things: work, Mason school, the weather. When we hugged goodbye, it was brief and real, not obligatory. After that, the weeks settled into a new rhythm: fewer family messages, less noise, more space. I started therapy again, not because I was in crisis, but because I wanted to understand myself outside of survival mode. In those sessions, I talked about the reliable daughter, the peacemaker, the one who learned early that love came with conditions. My therapist asked me once what I was afraid would happen if I stopped being that person. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "I was afraid I wouldn't be loved," I said. And now she asked gently. I considered my apartment, my quiet evenings, my steadier heart. I considered the way my mother's love had always required me to disappear just a little. "Now I'm afraid I won't love myself if I go back," I said. That felt like the truest thing I had ever said out loud. One afternoon, my brother called again. His tone was different this time, less accusatory, more tired. "Mom's thinking about selling the house," he said, "or downsizing. She keeps saying she doesn't recognize her life anymore." I imagined my mother in a house too big for her anger, pacing rooms full of old furniture and old grievances. The image didn't make me feel victorious. It made me feel sad in a distant way. "I'm not responsible for her life," I said quietly. He was silent for a moment, then sighed. "I guess not." That was all. No argument, no guilt trip. Just an acknowledgement that landed softly and stayed there. As winter shifted toward spring, I noticed something else changing: my body, the way I held myself. I didn't flinch as often. I didn't apologize reflexively. When someone asked me for a favor, I paused before answering, checking in with myself instead of automatically saying yes. The world didn't collapse because of it. One evening, as I was locking up my apartment for the night, I caught my reflection in the mirror by the door. I looked different. Not physically, not really, but in the eyes. There was something steadier there. Less question. I thought about the version of myself who would have opened the door to my mother without hesitation, who would have explained herself into exhaustion, who would have absorbed blame just to keep the peace. I felt tenderness for her. She had done the best she could with what she knew. She had survived. But she wasn't running things anymore. The last contact from my mother came unexpectedly. Not a letter, not a call. A message sent through my aunt forwarded without comment. She says she hopes you're happy now, my aunt wrote. She says she doesn't understand how things got so bad. I stared at the screen, then closed it. I didn't respond. Because the truth was, I did understand how things got so bad. They got bad the moment my no stopped meaning anything. They got bad when my home was treated like a resource, my time like a given, my boundaries like a challenge. And they got better the moment I stopped trying to convince anyone of that. On a quiet Sunday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with sunlight streaming in my notebook open in front of me. I flipped through the pages I had written over the past months, the anger, the clarity, the grief, the resolve. I stopped at the list I had made early on the one titled, What I Will and Won't Accept. I read it again, then added one more line at the bottom. I will choose myself without apology. I closed the notebook and sat there for a moment, letting the weight of that settle. There was no fanfare, no audience, just a quiet certainty. I knew there would be moments of doubt ahead. Holidays, family events, times when loneliness would whisper that it might be easier to go back. But I also knew something else now. Going back would cost me everything I had just learned to protect. I stood up, rinsed my mug, and moved through my apartment with ease. Outside, the city hummed along, indifferent and alive. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the part where the noise faded and the work of living began. And for the first time, I was ready for that. Spring arrived without asking for permission the way it always does, light slipping in through my windows earlier each morning, the air softening, the city slowly shedding its heaviness. I noticed it one quiet afternoon as I stood by my window, coffee cooling in my hands, watching a tree across the street bud for the first time since everything had happened. It felt like a small private sign that life moves forward even when families try to drag you backward. I hadn't heard from my mother directly in weeks. No blocked numbers trying to slip through, no handwritten notes, no messages funneled through relatives pretending to be neutral. The silence was not peaceful exactly, but it was honest. It told me she was waiting, recalibrating, deciding whether control could be regained or if she would have to change tactics. I was no longer waiting with her. That realization settled into me slowly then, all at once. I didn't jump when my phone buzzed anymore. I didn't rehearse explanations in my head before family gatherings I hadn't even agreed to attend. I woke up and went to bed without bracing myself for conflict. The nervous system remembers safety the same way it remembers fear, through repetition, through quiet proof. On a Saturday morning, I met Tessa again, this time at a playground near her new place. Mason ran ahead of us, shoes untied, shouting about something urgent and unimportant. Watching him, I felt that familiar tug of guilt, the old voice whispering that I had hurt him by not staying, by not fixing everything. Then I watched Tessa step in, kneel down, tie his shoe, speak to him gently but firmly. She looked different now. Tired, yes, but present in a way she hadn't been before. "You're doing okay?" I said, not as reassurance, but as recognition. She nodded. "It's harder without backup," she admitted. "But it's also clearer. I don't get to pretend things will magically work out anymore." I smiled at that. "Neither do I." We sat on a bench while Mason played, the sun warm on our faces. Tessa hesitated, then spoke. "Mom keeps asking if I think you'll ever talk to her again," she said. I considered the question carefully, not because I owed an answer, but because I owed myself honesty. "Maybe," I said. "But not like before." She looked at me, really looked at me, then nodded. I get that. That was it. No pressure, no negotiation, just acceptance. It felt like a small miracle. Later that day, back in my apartment, I finally did something I'd been putting off. I took out the box of old photos and letters I had kept for years, the ones that documented my family history in snapshots and handwriting. I spread them out on my table, touching each one carefully. There was my mother when she was younger, smiling wide, confident, beautiful in the way people are before life hardens them. There was me as a child, always positioned just a little closer to her than everyone else, already learning where my place was. There were birthdays and holidays and moments that looked happy from the outside. I didn't throw any of it away. Instead, I sorted it. Not to erase the past, but to understand it. To see the patterns clearly without nostalgia blurring the edges. Love and control tangled together. Care offered with strings attached. Affection that tightened instead of freeing. I packed the photos back up and put the box away, not out of reach, just no longer at the center of my life. That evening, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I stared at it for a long moment, my chest tightening, then easing as I reminded myself I had options now. I answered. It was my mother. I didn't speak right away. Neither did she. The silence stretched thick and awkward. I don't know how to talk to you anymore, she said finally, her voice quieter than I remembered. I closed my eyes, leaning back against my couch. You can start by listening, I said. She exhaled sharply. I feel like I lost you. I chose my words carefully. You lost access, I said. Not me. She didn't argue. That alone told me something had shifted, even if only slightly. I made mistakes. She said the words stiff, like they didn't come naturally. I was trying to help. I waited. After a long pause, she added, I didn't think about what it would cost you. That was as close as she could come, at least for now. I didn't rush her further. Growth, when it comes slow, especially for people who have built their identity around being right. If we're going to have any kind of relationship, I said, it has to be different. No keys, no surprises, no decisions about my life without me. Another pause. Then quietly, I understand. I didn't promise anything else. I didn't invite her over. I didn't soften the boundary. We ended the call politely, carefully, like two people learning a new language. When the line went dead, I sat there for a long time, letting the mix of emotions wash through me. Relief, sadness, cautious hope. I didn't need to label any of it. I just needed to feel it without running. Weeks passed. Life continued. Work routines, small joys. I hosted friends in my apartment, laughing freely, no tension under the surface. I slept with my door locked and my mind at ease. I said no when I needed to, yes when I wanted to, and learned to tell the difference. One evening, as I was washing dishes, I caught my reflection in the window, city lights flickering behind me. I looked older somehow, not in years, but in gravity, in self-possession. I thought about the day my mother copied my keys, how small and trapped I had felt standing in my own home, watching my autonomy slip through my fingers. I thought about the knock on the door, the uniforms, the fear, and the resolve tangled together in my chest. And I thought about now, the quiet, the space, the way my life finally fit me. This wasn't revenge in the way people like to imagine it. There was no dramatic victory, no moment where everyone applauded my courage. The real payback was quieter and more permanent. It was waking up without dread. It was locking my door and knowing it meant something. It was understanding that love does not require self-erasure, and family does not get a free pass to harm you just because they share your blood. If you've ever been the reliable one, the built-in babysitter, the fixer, the one everyone counts on until there's nothing left of you, I want you to hear this. You are not selfish for protecting your space. You are not cruel for saying no. And you are not required to set yourself on fire so someone else can feel warm. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining, stop negotiating, and quietly choose yourself. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived some version of this, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let other women know they're not alone. And if you want more stories about boundaries, justice, and what it really looks like when the tables turn, stay here with me. Because the moment you reclaim your life, the story doesn't end. That's when it finally begins.